Right, it's 9:30. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's time for me to open this hearing session on Matter 10, High Quality Design. So for those of you who haven't met us yet, I'm Dr. Rachel Bust, and this is my colleague, Ms. Caroline Malloy. So we're the inspectors jointly appointed to hold the examination of the Lewisham local plan. So before I get too further into this, can everyone hear me okay? Looking to the back of the room, some thumbs up around the table. That's good, thank you. Please could everyone make sure the mobile phones and any other electronic devices are on silent or muted. It's possibly a good idea to keep the mobile phones and devices away from the microphones because we do occasionally get a little bit of interference. Experience so far is that you need to sit relatively close to the microphones to pick up everything. It doesn't have a particularly wide field. And that's important because we are being live streamed, so it needs to be heard for anyone who's watching online. Does anyone present have any objections to the live streaming? No, thank you. So turning to the council for some housekeeping, could you remind all the people present of the housekeeping arrangements? Thank you.
Yes, I'll do that. There is no planned fire alarm test, so if the fire alarm goes off, please vacate the building. The emergency exits are clearly signposted. Our rendezvous point, in case of a fire alarm, is on the Broadway next to Costa Coffee. Hopefully everyone is aware of where that is. Toilet facilities are out the door to the left and are clearly signposted.
Thank you for that. So the weather looks set to be warmer this week, so we understand the air conditioning is adjusted remotely from the building, but the council will keep an eye on that. But do feel free to remove jackets and outer garments as necessary. We've got plenty of water in the water cooler outside. So the procedure for the hearing session will take the form of a structured discussion, which we will be leading based on the agenda. Which follows on from the matters, issues and questions previously circulated. Does everyone have sight of an agenda? Thank you. We will try and bring you in at a relevant point, but if you do wish to make a point, please turn your nameplate up on its end and we will try and bring you in as soon as we can. So just to remind everyone taking part in the discussion, you should have provided all of your evidence so far in your original representation. So the hearing sessions are not an opportunity to present further evidence, submit anything further. Any comments that you may make during the session need to be related directly to your representation. Please do respect each other. We've got a number of participants. There are probably a lot of points that people want to make, but allow people to finish their point before moving on. Does anyone have any questions at this stage about the procedure for the session? Thank you. So just before we move on, we have been handed from the council this morning an addendum to the modifications, some of which relate to matters 10 and 11, so the two matters for this morning. I wonder whether the council wouldn't mind just outlining the purpose of what they are and the purpose of them. We'll leave the detail to when we get to the point in the relevant discussion, but if you could just do that for us, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Could I say we've not seen those, and they may not be relevant to us, but it would be helpful if we could have a copy. That's possible.
They will be published in due course on the examination website.
Yes.
In responding to the inspector's question, the proposed amendments to the modifications, so these are modifications set out under submitted document PD11, which is I dare say a very dynamic document in that it seeks to aid in the mapping of the proposed modifications. The amendments submitted this morning are fairly modest and minor. They relate to MO 179, MO 195, MO 23, MO 155, and MO 273, and in the main reflect factual positions. So, for example, the status of conservation areas, the London View Management Framework, and the London Squares status. I believe to help the gentleman on the other side of the table, only one of those proposed amendments to the modifications relates to the high quality design chapter.
Thank you. Is there other copies available for other people around the table? We will read out the modifications as we get to them, but it would be helpful if some copies could be circulated, if that's possible, please.
Yes, and my apologies that for the lateness of this submission. It's as I alluded to you both yesterday. This is the blame rests entirely with me personally, and the sort of the nature of how they were communicated from colleagues, that there were some difficulties in fully understanding what was required. So that's all resolved.
Thank you for that. Okay, so if we'll move on to introductions for today's session, can I ask participants to introduce themselves? I will begin with the council, please. Mr. Syme.
Hi there. My name is David Syme. I'm the head of strategic planning here at Lewisham.
Jim? Sorry, could you just repeat that? If you wouldn't mind just tilting your nameplates, it would be quite helpful to me. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Ruth Coulson. I'm the Principal Urban Design Officer at Lewisham Council.
Morning, everyone. I'm Joanna Eccleston. I'm the Senior Conservation Officer at Lewisham.
Good morning, Ma'am. Ben Ford from Quad, representing Land Sec.
Good morning. My name is Simon McCormack of Discourse Architecture, representing the Sydenham Society.
Hello, everyone. I'm Annabelle McLaren from the Sydenham Society.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jan Morrison from the Sydenham Hill Residents.
Good morning. I'm Peter Luder from Culverley Green Residents Association.
Morning, ma'am. Grant Liggett of Boyer Planning, representing Astur.
Morning, madam. I'm Chris Mealy from Montague Evans, representing Astur.
I'm Russell Harris, KC, representing Astur. We provided a schedule of our appearances with qualifications to the programme officer, if that's helpful.
Yes, I've received that. Thank you. So just to those participants that are representing a group, just to check that you do have the authority to speak on behalf of the groups, the Sydenham Society and Sydenham Hill Residents and Culverley Green. Thank you. Right, so moving to the agenda, I'm going to work through the agenda. There are some policies that are will make more of a discussion, that will be more of a discussion of than others. So we will keep an eye on the time. and we'll hopefully keep moving through the agenda. So to open up the agenda, we've got my question 10.1 about the level of detail. Now this is in the council statement in paragraph 10.1.2. There's a suggestion of a proposed modification, which I think made its way into the list of 169. Could I just ask the council just to explain the reason for this proposed modification to criterion A, please?
Yes, the modification suggests removing text which is actually repeated in the policy, almost word for word. We felt that it would be useful to reduce that in terms of the overall text. As I said, it's just a statement which repeats one of the criteria below.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. So moving on to QD1. So that's the policy on delivering high quality design in Lewisham. Couple of questions there, 10.2, 10.3. So around the issue of pre-application advice, community engagement. Just looking at the criterion, so we're moving into, I've got on my list criterion J. I think this has cropped up in an earlier session about the role of consultation, whether it should actually be listed in a policy or not. Now, I don't think there'll be anyone who disputes that pre-application advice is a good thing in the interests of getting to a good quality scheme. But looking at criterion J there, it potentially gives the impression that if it's sort of expected by the council, it must happen. And in terms of not everybody would use the pre-application advice, you'd hope that they would, but if they don't, how would their proposal be received? Maybe there may be concerns. So I think the council have put forward in 10.2.4 a very an alteration there, which is just to adjust any feedback received from the council, and I think that possibly just means that it's any feedback as opposed to more definite feedback.
Yes, that was the intention. Just to be clear, the intention was not to mandate pre-application consultation, but obviously appreciate that it is a particularly good thing, particularly for major schemes. So I think we're just proposing the modification to make it clear that it isn't mandatory. That, however, that any feedback that you receive during the process should be taken into consideration.
And just on the same theme, the council have proposed a modification to criterion K. Again, just the council just to confirm the background to that one as well, please.
Yes, again, this is just to clarify that is not mandatory. That is a recommendation, but obviously, depending on the scale of development, it may not be possible. So I think we've recommended some minor modifications to the text to make that clear, and we'll seek the inspector's view on whether it does so.
Thank you. For the Sydenham Society, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. Our view is that the criteria for the requirement to have a master plan are poorly defined in the document, and we feel that there are certain strategic sites, particularly the Bell Green retail site, where there should be a master plan, and that the responsibility for preparing the master plan should rest with the council. We feel that the suggestion that developers should take responsibility for a master plan is unreasonable and unlikely to work. Is that okay?
Sorry, just in terms of which criteria and policy are you relating that to, sir?
Oh. Well, what David Symes was just saying, that it was a sort of a guideline, and we feel that the requirement should be strengthened.
Okay, I've got your point. I'm just going to come back to the council.
Sorry, requirement K.
Yeah, just to clarify, so part K of the policy doesn't refer specifically to master plan. This is in relation to consultation with public consultation prior to the submission of applications, so pre-submission consultation. It isn't specifically related to a master plan. There is other policies within the plan that relates to master planning work, which I'm sure we'll come on to in the future.
So moving on to the design review panel. So our question 10.4. So in the council statement, the list of the indicative criteria for development proposals to be considered by the design review panel, that's helpful. But in terms of how would a user know from picking up the plan when a proposal would go, and how would they know if they were submitting a proposal whether their scheme would go towards the design review panel? We're just looking at it from terms of effectiveness to make sure it's clear and unambiguous.
So I would refer the inspectors to paragraph 5.7 in the supporting text, which effectively outlines the purpose of the design review panel, and effectively says proposals for major developments and other developments likely to have significant local impacts should be brought to the panel at an early stage in the planning process. So we feel that provides, sufficient guidance for kind of planning or applicants. Generally speaking, on a practical level, it's really for major developments that we see design review panel design reviews coming forward, and generally for larger major applications of say 50 plus units. It is pretty much guaranteed that when we're dealing with a site 50 plus units, there will be pre-application consultation with the council, and the applicants will be engaging with the planning officer to discuss that programme of pre-application and whether a design review panel is suitable. Design review panels are a fairly standard process, particularly within London. I think most London boroughs have a form of design review panel, so it's a fairly tried and tested approach.
So the majority of those bullet points, I can understand that the scale of there, but the one on the end, the final one, development that has a significant importance to an area or community. It doesn't guarantee that would be of a major size, because there could potentially be schemes that do have significant importance to a local community, but might be of a smaller than major, if I can put it that way around. Is that likely in the Lewisham context?
I think obviously these can be interpreted, but again, just to say that the design review panel process is not a mandatory process, and therefore these are recommendations and guidelines. And I think I'd draw the inspector's attention to the actual supporting text of the policy rather than the more thorough, detailed bullet points. I think the paragraph 5.7 and the statement that I just read out is more reflective of, on a practical level, what comes to design review panel and what the council would expect to come to a design review panel.
So just still on that theme of how people would know, I hear what you say about paragraph 5.7, but is there something on the website that you advertise this design review panel? Is there any sort of further information that could generally guide people?
Yes, there are terms of reference for the design review panel on our website.
Thank you. So just moving on to 10.5. And that's related to the National Design Guide. So in the council statement in paragraph 10.5.1, we've got a few more bullet points there to help with the response to that question. I'm just wondering whether or not there is something in the plan that kind of gives all of those in one composite list, because they reference to these pop up throughout the plan, don't they?
Yeah, sorry, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think we acknowledge that policy QD1 Part A should reference the National Design Guide, and actually, particularly Part C and the bullet points thereafter are effectively a list which is the Lewisham's kind of interpretation, but we feel that, and we've suggested a modification which more directly references the National Design Guide and the 10 characteristics of well-designed places as described in the National Design Guide. So context, identity, built form, movement, nature, public spaces, uses, homes and buildings, resources and lifespan be inserted within that Part C plan instead of the list of criteria that we have listed. Again, there's such a significant overlap, it seems sensible to use the reference to the established National Design Guide.
Thank you. Just on the list that you've got in 10.5.1, does that list exist somewhere within the plan as a composite list, or is it just referenced wherever it is most relevant through the plan?
My apologies, Dr. Bust. I misunderstood the question. So there is a list of supplementary planning documents that and area frameworks that we've listed in our response to 10.5.1. So area guide, supplementary planning documents, and also the neighbourhood plans. I believe there is a list. I'm looking at my colleague Carol here, but if there isn't a list, we can certainly put that list within the local plan, either within the appendix or, if it's appropriate, in the supporting text of QD1. We will take advice from the inspectors.
Thank you. We'll give that some thought in terms of where it might be best placed, and we'll pick that up in due course. So yes, just moving into the National Design Guide, and Mr. Syme, you sort of went on to talk about the 10 characteristics. I'm coming to that. I'm just wondering whether the 10 characteristics, the design guide is important, and I think the reference in the policy is necessary. Whether the 10 characteristics need to be within the policy or not is something that's just circulating in my mind. We don't know whether the National Design Guide may change in the future, and if they were in the policy, there is potential that someone may say that the policy is then out of date if something does change. So I don't have an issue with the plan referring to the 10 characteristics, but perhaps the supporting text may be a better place for them, because it's to guide people, which I would envisage that you would be using those 10 characteristics in consideration in the development management process anyway.
Yep, that's correct. And yeah, the council doesn't have any issue with that.
So just to finish off that policy, have we covered everything in the modifications? I'm looking to the council to assist us to make sure that we've covered everything. I think paragraph 10.6.3, Mr. Syme, of the council statement. I think you've got some more bits in red proposed there.
Yes, there's some minor changes or minor modifications that we are suggesting.
So just if you could help us with the background for those, if possible, or a member of your team, please.
They're included to be consistent with the National Design Guide. So those terms are referred to in the National Design Guide policy, C1. So we're just ensuring they're consistent.
So that was for the consistency with the National Design Guide. Yes, thank you. Any other points from anyone else who has made representations on policy QD1? Did the Culverley Green Residents Association have anything on this policy?
No, Madam, we didn't comment specifically on this policy, and it does already in 10.6.3 make reference to the significance of heritage assets and their setting, which is what we're looking for as a consistent thread throughout these design quality policies.
Thank you. Yes, I picked up throughout your representation there were sort of highlighting across different things. So I was just checking to explore what the reason for the highlighting was, but you've explained that. Thank you. Okay, turning to policy QD2 then, please. That is the inclusive and safe design policy. And I think the council have got a proposed modification following on from our question 10.12, a modification to criterion A. So I think that comes up in your statement 10.12.1.
Yes, this is to cover off the helpful suggestion question from the inspectors, just to make clear that the inclusive design statement should be a component of the design analysis statement.
Thank you, that's helpful. Anything else on QD2 that anyone has raised? Looking around the room, no. Thank you, Mr. Syme. So let's move on to QD3, please. This is public realm and connecting places. So our question 10.17 relates to criterion F. And I'm just wondering, in that, does it, there's sort of a theme of consultation pre-application here. Does it assume that the pre-application process is used here, or whether there would be, if it's not used, is it likely that there might be potential delays in the planning application process with amendments? Please help me if I'm misreading that.
I mean, we felt that the part F provided enough flexibility with the use of the term consideration, and clearly that will be proportionate to the type of application and the scale of application. But again, if there is concern regarding whether or not an applicant would understand whether the scale of development should be considering these things, we can take a look at that and provide some more clarity on that if that is that's considered. Yes, if that is required.
Thank you, Mr. Syme. I think that would be helpful. I'm thinking of proposals that may be wondering whether benches and other types of seating, or reference to toilets and changing facilities, whether somebody coming forward with a proposal may also think, does that apply to me? But also, how many of these features in this criterion would I be expected to provide, and would there be any room left for the actual development? So I think if you would like to reflect on that, I would be grateful. Thank you. So in terms of QD3, there's a couple of modifications there. Mr. Syme, if you could just take us through those modifications, please.
Yes, we're looking at a modification to part the public art, and this is to respond to the inspector's questions. Again, very similar to the previous point, to make it clear that we'd be looking for major development to investigate opportunities to integrate public art. So to make it clear to applicants that for minor developments, we wouldn't be asking them to look at those options.
So you've got a little alteration in your statement of 10.18.2, which is just related to criterion H. I think that's an additional modification. It wouldn't be a main modification.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
In your statement, in paragraph 10.18.2,
Yes.
there's just a little bit in red.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, that's the response to public art. So we are removing the word particularly for major developments, and just to make it clear that it's for major developments, to rule out minor applications, essentially having to consider public art.
Thank you. And MO13 is a typographical error.
That's correct, yes.
And 14 makes reference to the Transport for London Streetscape guidance as opposed to just guidance. So that makes it more specific to plan users.
Indeed, yes.
Thank you. Right, thank you for that. We're going to move on to QD4, which is the building heights. So I think I'll take the proposed modifications sort of towards the end of this topic rather than starting with my 2 bullet points at the top. So in terms of consistency with policy OL1 and the spatial strategy, so our question 1026. And I think this is a matter that has been put to us, and Culvery Green Residents Association. I think your statement your representation picks up this, and also Sydenham Hill residents have got their Toblerone up. Who would like to start?
Madam, I think our concern lies in what is supposedly informing what in the process, because if you refer to the tall building review from January 23, at paragraph 430, it states that defining maximum heights in each area meets the requirements of the London Plan to remove ambiguity on acceptability of tall development. Now that suggests that a height indicated in the tall buildings plan is one that the council is comfortable with. It's removed ambiguity, and yet the policy itself and the council's responses to it indicate that further testing will be necessary, particularly in sensitive sites. There's also the question of whether the the A21 framework, because that's the area that we're concerned about, is actually based on the assessments of height, or whether they're based on the draft capacities that were in the regulation 18 version of the local plan. i.e. did the capacity come first and then the height was adjusted to meet it? Or did the tall buildings review set heights? In either instance, we question whether that can really be compatible with a spatial strategy which correctly takes account of heritage assets amongst other elements, as in policy HE2, because there hasn't been the granular assessment of individual sites that can only come with applications. And that's where we have a concern that developers might latch on to the height figures in the policies, the tall building plan. I think it's figures 5.1 and 5.2, without acknowledging and accepting that that process is far from complete. I'll leave it at that as an opener.
Thank you. And to follow on with Sydenham Hills Residents Association, and then I'll come to the council response.
Yes, so apologies because this is a fairly specific thing, but in looking at paragraph D and its sub points, there is no recognition that I can find, or indeed any of my colleagues can find, that the height of Sydenham Ridge has been considered. And if I can give you a little bit of context, Sydenham Ridge is part of the Claygate Ridge, which runs from Claygate in the west at Surrey all the way through to Woolwich Arsenal. But the ridge itself, Sydenham Ridge, has a particular geological structure which makes it higher than other parts. And when you look at London, you'll be very much aware of the Crystal Palace aerial, which is almost at the tip of Lewisham southwest, stands up above London and above the tree line. The road Sydenham Hill actually has the highest point in the whole of South London on it at 112 metres, just at the top of Wells Park Road, which is part of Lewisham. And if you start with a height of 112 metres and then add your 30 metres or even 25 metres for a building, it will dwarf the area. It will also be extraordinarily visible across the whole of London. From the top of Sydenham Hill, you can see right across to the Heathrow Airport Tower. And you can also see right back across Kent. So this is not so much a local issue. And that has been one of our major concerns, that in doing a local plan quite reasonably, Lewisham has looked to local issues. But the strategic nature of Sydenham Ridge, we feel, has been very much overlooked. We would urge that it is considered and given specific consideration within the plan. Thank you.
I'm just going to let the council respond, and then I will come back to Culverley Green and Sydenham Society. Mr. Syme, who would like to respond from the council, please?
Yes, I will kick off. If the inspectors will indulge me, it might be useful if I just set the context for the building heights and the methodology that we've undertaken and the evidence base that we have to support the suitability zones and the maximum heights. I think obviously tall buildings is one of the key elements that we'll be discussing through this session, and I think it might be helpful if I take people through what we've done. So If that's okay, I'll start. And if I am going on too much, please interrupt me. I'm sure I could, debate this for a couple of hours here. Obviously, the local plan is responding to specific requirements set out in the London Plan, policy D9 on tall buildings. The London Plan directs local authorities and development plans to consider areas that are suitable for tall buildings, to be quite specific about where those areas are. And then in paragraph 3.9.2 of the London Plan supporting text, it essentially says that boroughs should determine and identify locations where tall buildings may be an appropriate form of development by undertaking the steps below, based on the areas identified for growth as part of policy D1, London's form, character and capacity for growth, undertake a sieving exercise by assessing potential visual and cumulative impact to consider where there are locations where tall buildings could have a role in contributing to the emerging character and vision for the place. In these locations, determine the maximum height that could be acceptable. Identify these locations and heights on maps in development plans. So that sets out the broad framework for what the local plan has to do. In terms of the evidence base that underpins our policy, again, if I may take you through the sequencing of the work that we've done. And I think that's important because the evidence is sequential. So essentially we build upon the previous evidence base, and then we continue to drill down into more granular detail at each of the stages, and I'll explain why. So we submitted document EB05, the tall building study, which was published in 2021, prepared through 2020, and informed the Regulation 18 consultation document. This was prepared with support from Eliza Morrison, urban practitioners, experts in this field, and also the consultants who worked and prepared the characterisation study, which was instrumental in preparing the local plan's spatial strategy. The study sets out a robust methodology building on this characterisation study and the subsequent understanding of the physical characteristics of the borough, including existing and emerging building heights across the borough. Chapter 3 of this document, page 29 of EB03, sets out the methodology that we have undertaken. And it breaks the assessment down into two components: an assessment of suitability. And again, the criteria that we drew for the assessment of suitability was drawn broadly from the London Plan and London SLA at that time, which directed very high densities to certain locations. The criteria is essentially listed in the pages that follow. Broadly, accessibility, so public transport accessibility or proximity to future transport projects. The location, so whether the site is identified within an opportunity area, whether the site is identified in a town centre, whether it's identified in a growth area responding to either the characterisation study or any other study that the council had endorsed, such as the New Cross Area Framework, etc. And what that did was it resulted in a layering of those criteria and essentially identifies the suitability as a shaded kind of green diagram. The most suitable sites are identified by a darker shade of green versus no shade, which is effectively saying that those sites are inappropriate. What we also did was on page 51, we mapped the potential site allocations at that stage through the Regulation 18 to effectively cross-reference to our spatial strategy and the sites that we had available to make sure that the suitability assessment was supporting our spatial strategy. We then did an assessment of sensitivities, recognizing that an assessment of suitability didn't necessarily consider impact. And impact is one of the key criteria within the London plan to identify. So just to be clear, there may be areas which are suitable locations under the criteria above, but that could have significant sensitivities, such as areas within conservation areas, etc. So we did an assessment of the sensitivities. We pulled those criteria from the London plan and from our professional judgment. That includes heritage designations and a hierarchy therein. Views, principally the LVMF views, but also our core strategy, our adopted core strategy views at the time. We drew upon the characterization study and looked at the consistency of heights and character. And by that, I mean, the impact of putting, say, a 30-story building in Downham, which is predominantly two-story suburban character, would have a significant impact. So that was something that we considered. And then the topography, which we also considered. We're very conscious that there is a kind of natural valley that Lewisham has. The central area, the A21, Catford Town Centre, Lewisham, and the northern parts of the borough are all lower than the ridges that rise up. So again, looking at sensitivities, if we were to locate, a 20-story building in Sydenham Hill Ridge, for example, that would have a significant impact. So those are the assessments that we did. And at that time, and forgive me if I'm going on, at that time in terms of the Regulation 18 publication, that's as far as we went. This is prior to the adoption of the London Plan in April 2021. In the GLA's Regulation 18 reps, they highlighted that the plan failed to fully respond to the paragraph 3.9.2, as it didn't clearly define suitable areas. We broadly defined them, but we weren't clearly identifying with a boundary, essentially, and we hadn't put maximum heights to that. I think it's fair to say as well that it was also a key concern that community groups and members of the public had through the Regulation 18 consultation. They wanted certainty on, where these tall buildings were going to go and what height those tall buildings would be proposed at. So we then prepared the tall building addendum, which is EB02, to specifically address that issue. And again, I want to make the point that this was a refinement of the methodology. And essentially what we did was we drilled down into those areas of suitability to essentially a neighbourhood area to provide a more granular assessment of both suitability and sensitivity. And what that did then was, the outcomes of that was it identified clearly areas identified suitable for tall buildings. And for each of the suitability zones, there was a maximum height which was applied. This obviously complied with the GLA. At that time, we were consulting with the GLA through the methodology to make sure that they were happy with that methodology and it was robust, which they were. And then we moved on to the emerging Regulation 19 local plan. Now, again, at that time, I think it's fair to say we published the addendum and we were obviously consulting with councillors through the Regulation 19 prep work. And again, there was some concerns about the assessment, and in particular, the concerns were generally focused around the broad nature of the sites and the fact that some areas within those suitability zones covered areas which would not be developable. And that included some open space, some newly built development, schools, etc. so that was one issue, and the second issue was the broad nature taken to the maximum heights. We applied a fairly liberal approach, I would say, at that stage, based on the neighbourhood level of that document. That leads me on to my final document, and apologies this is taking so long, but I do think it's important chronologically to go through this. And the council prepared EB01, which was the Tall Building Review 2023. And again, just to be clear, this is a refinement of the previous evidence that had been done. And again, what it does is it looks in even further granular detail to refine the suitability areas and reconsider maximum heights responding to existing and emerging character. So the methodology, which I won't go through in detail, but that's outlined within the study from paragraph 4.2 onwards. It effectively covers 4 broad steps. The first one is to characterize, so look at the suitability areas identified in the previous study and break that down into individual sites defined by their existing physical characteristics, designations, that type of thing. We then look to exclude sites or areas within that suitability zone which were inappropriate for development. So as described, those are open space designations, newly built development, schools, existing residential areas in multiple ownership that had no prospect of being delivered within the plan period. We then did an analysis of the emerging character, drawing from the endorsed frameworks that we have, any approved applications, and also built form around the kind of emerging character of those sites. And then finally, we made a series of recommendations. And I think what you'll see is within that document, you know, an example would be from page 10 onwards and the related diagrams of Lewisham Town Centre, is that from the 2022 evidence, which covered quite a significant broad area, the Tall Building Review of 2023 refined and constrained that area down to actual developable sites which are suitable for tall buildings. And we then responded with a much more granular approach to the maximum building heights, responding to existing and future characters. Furthermore, I would just like to point out that, you know, the council fundamentally believes that this approach is sound and it's a robust methodology for determining the suitability and suggested maximum heights. Indeed, this approach has been taken forward as part of lots of other London Borough local plan work, and Eliza Morrison must be making a lot of money because they're doing a lot of them. Hounslow, Croydon, Sutton, Harrow, Ealing are all taking this approach, very similar approach to this kind of high level strategic analysis of sensitivities and suitabilities, then drilling down into more detail. I think just to finalise, I think in response to some of our community groups and residents, we know that the study and the evidence has its limitations. It is a local plan evidence base, and the council hasn't master planned each area. It hasn't tested 3-dimensional options and explored in detail the visual and physical impacts of tall buildings on individual sites. It hasn't tested environmental factors, overshadowing, microclimate analysis, etc. So the council concedes that, you know, this This evidence doesn't do that, and that is why there is inherent flexibility within the policy. We make it very clear that just because your site is within an area of suitability doesn't necessarily mean it's suitable for tall buildings everywhere, and that has to be tested through the development management process. The council just doesn't have the resources or the financial ability to master plan every site within the local plan. And I would argue in terms of the MPPF that in terms of proportionate evidence that is not required. At this scale, at this level of a strategic document of the local plan, I think we have done personally a very good job in providing a solid basis which will then have to be developed through the development management process for individual sites. And again, I just want to be clear that in terms of the policy, there is the inherent flexibility. Obviously, we'll have representatives of landowners saying, it should be higher, etc. We may have residents and residents associations saying it may be lower. I am pleased to see that generally around the table we haven't got that many representatives from sites at the table disputing this evidence, and in fact there was genuine support from our development industry for the process and the engagement that we did, and I think there was whilst I accept in terms of residents and residents association that they may not be happy with some of the outcomes, I think the question is, do they fundamentally dispute the methodology that we've gone through? We believe it's robust, and we believe it's based on robust evidence in our professional judgment.
Thank you, Mr. Syme. You've explained a lot there for us to digest and absorb, and I'm sure participants around the table will be picking up on some of the points that you've made in that explanation there. I'm just going to turn to those parties that have got Toblerones up. So could I start with the Sydenham Society, and I'll just work around the room if that's okay.
Thank you. I think we sort of challenged the criteria that he used to determine the acceptable height of tall buildings, because we feel that that they will become like a sort of maximum, or it will become a sort of target for developers. And we're particularly concerned about Bell Green, which is the section part C, G of policy, which gives a height of 12 to 16 stories. Now, the highest buildings in the south of the borough are 9 stories, and the site is surrounded by partly by terraces that are 2 stories. So we feel that in terms of urban criteria, that the height would be excessive and not consistent with the London plan policy. Was it 9, which talks about London plan 3.9.1. Whilst high density does not need to imply high rise, tall buildings can form part of a plan-led approach. So we feel that there's too much of a sort of an assumption that tall buildings would be acceptable. We feel that in terms of the relationship with the context at this particular site, which is the Bell Green and Lower Sydenham site, that would be excessive. And we would advocate a maximum height of 8 stories and associated with street-based development, with the exception of the immediate vicinity of the transport hub, where we feel that taller buildings up to 16 stories would be appropriate because of their proximity to these transport facilities. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Sydenham Hill residents have got the Toblerone. I'll just move around the table in sequence if you don't mind.
That would help. Sorry. Thank you. picking up on some of what David Syme was saying, we do absolutely appreciate how stretched council officers are and how much work needs doing. And we are very supportive and always willing to help out with some of that sort of groundwork as such. However, there are some inconsistencies in reality that we have come across. For example, we have been told that the tall building policy is not mandatory. It is guidance only. And if that is true, and I know it was, I believe it was one of the community interest meetings where it was said, we were certainly given to understand that from application to application, from our perspective, a fairly random decision might be taken. The characterization study that you've mentioned was known to be faulty in relation to Sydenham Ridge at the time. There was a consultation group, quite a small one, I believe, that was called in by the consultants to sort of check how well they were doing. And I believe it's on page 37 of that study, it says that they were very much aware that for Upper Sydenham, there was a lot more work to be done. There was a lot they didn't understand about the heritage and various other things. My third point on this, sorry about it, is that the document on Sydenham Ridge that has been uploaded to the examinations website, whilst being wonderfully comprehensive in many ways, and thank you, Joanna, I imagine you were behind it, but it doesn't actually mention the height at all. And finally, and this is very much micro, we are currently experiencing a build on Sydenham Ridge of an estate called Mays House, where sheltered housing was taken down of a few stories high, and up to 7 stories are now going up. And this particular development breaks the tree line on the ridge for the first time. That tree line has remained intact for centuries, and it will break that tree line. I think it's got up to about story 4 or 5 at the moment, but it will be higher. And whilst the policy constantly refers to some tall buildings being exceptional, we fear that it sets a precedent and that actually every developer will expect to exceed the tree line. Thank you.
I'm going to continue to move around the table if that's acceptable to the council, if you're sort of taking notes of the points as we go along, and then I'll come back to you. So Culverley Green Residents Association, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I just wanted to clarify one of the points I made before. I perhaps didn't demonstrate exactly where I was taking the point from. I referred to the A21 framework document as being based on capacities, i.e., which came first, the capacities or the height studies. I actually am referring to the comments and responses document that the council issued on the 10th of February 2022. I'm not sure whether it has a number in this inquiry, but it's the Development Framework Formal Consultation Comments and Responses. And on page 131, there is a comment that states, in terms of scale and massing, the A21 development framework is responding to the indicative capacities outlined in the site allocation of the draft local plan regulation 18 document. That's what I had said. I just thought I should draw to your attention exactly where I took that from, because I didn't earlier. In respect of the analysis, I mean, I focused on the tall building review from 23, since that's the most recent one, and not wishing to sort of make comments on the council's consultants, I do find some odd aspects of this document, not odd, inappropriate or incorrect elements that I think call into question its reliability as a background evidence document and thus the soundness of the policy. I'll just mention a couple of them. For example, under methodology, which Mr. Syme commented on, paragraph 4.2, which is on page 5, lists 8 search areas. That does not include Bellingham. That doesn't appear on that list. And yet, if you then turn to page 7, endorsed frameworks that exclude tall development, that heading, under paragraph 417, the A21 development framework is mentioned, and it states that sites directly fronting the A21 in Lewisham, Ladywell, Catford and Bellingham are referenced, with Bellingham being assessed as inappropriate for tall development, except at the Ravensbourne Retail Park site. So it was a search area because it wasn't totally excluded. So why isn't it on the list of sites at 4.2? I also find that as a result, the following on from in the methodology, step 2, exclude designation and assets section, raises some question. At 410, heritage assets, it explains that conservation areas in grade 2 listed buildings and structures are designated. Conservation areas have been given the highest weight of sensitivity in the first iteration of studies produced by Allies and Morrison. As such, there are no conservation areas remaining in the tall building suitability zones. Well, that's not correct, because part of Site 22, and I don't want to sort of delve in too much into that, but we're looking at the relevance of the evidence base for policy QD4. Part of the Ravensbourne Retail Park is within the Culverley Green Conservation Area. It actually overlaps. The open space part is within. So I would find that sentence incorrect as stated. And a further point is that there is reference under sensitive or transition sites being excluded as areas of uniform low density or low rise housing, or areas with a distinct coherence or character. So that explains why certain areas are excluded from the search areas for tall buildings. And later on, the section that covers Bellingham states that it's not a suitable area for tall buildings because it is low rise and consistent, whereas actually that equally applies to the Culverley Green area, which is consistently 2 stories apart from a few mixed commercial and residential flatted schemes along Bromley Road, which are 4 stories. And a further point, again, page 9, paragraph 427, the A21 development framework explains what the framework covers, and it refers to sites along the whole framework and the heights of buildings that would be identified, that are identified within it. It refers to Lewisham Town Centre, University Hospital Lewisham Park, Ladywell, Rushy Green, but there's no mention of Bellingham, which does appear in the framework. So this document excludes any reference to Bellingham, where this very document says that the Ravensbourne Retail Park is appropriate for tall buildings. So I could continue with one or two other elements, but I just want to demonstrate that this document, which is the evidence base for the policy, and I note that in the opening, Mr. Fenwick stressed the extent and length of history of preparation of the evidence base to support this local plan, and he commended it to yourselves. I would question whether it is indeed accurate. So your question as to whether or not the policy is sound does raise concerns on our part in terms of, well, what came first? The capacity requirements from the London plan and then the heights, and also this evidence base that it relies upon. Sorry.
Thank you. I think there are a number of points. As to living, thank you very much for your patience. Appreciate you're the end of the table and we're moving along. I think I'm just looking at the council and thinking of the number of points that have been raised before we get to you, and I'm conscious that I want to give the council due opportunity to respond to things so everyone can feel that they've heard a response. But if the list gets too long, then it's
well,
going to be.
We're entirely in your hands as to what is the best course. But I do happen to agree that I think if the council have a meaningful response now, it might be easier for both the local authority and yourselves to take that into account before listening to us.
I'm obliged. I'm going to turn to the council first then, please.
Yes, thank you. There's quite a few points there. In terms of the response by the Sydenham Society, I wasn't quite clear what criteria they were objecting to in terms of the evidence base. The evidence or the criteria that we've used throughout the evidence base seems to be again relates to London Plan criteria, accessibility, impact, etc. So I'm not quite clear what the objection to the methodology is. Now, I can appreciate there might be views in terms of the conclusion that we've come to and, suitable heights, etc. But in terms of the methodology and in terms of the criteria, I wasn't quite clear what the rebuttal is. I think we can, and there is opportunity to discuss Belgreen Lower Sydenham in later questions. So I'll be in the inspector's hands as to whether or not you want me to address that specific question now.
I think in terms of trying to look at the policy as a whole, I appreciate there are detailed points, and we do have a site allocation session, and there is potential that we could get into site details which would be more appropriately settled into that site allocations process. So I think if we could try just to focus on the policy and the principles and the methodology in the session, if there are from the council specific points in response to the specific questions and points that have been posed by participants, then if we could clear those up, then that would be great. But otherwise, let's leave the site specifics to the site allocations, please.
Okay, so as the council has said, through the evidence, we feel that it has been a robust process of looking at the suitability of sites in relation to the criteria outlined in the London Plan, but also using kind of professional judgment, and then the sensitivities, looking at the impacts of that tall buildings. Just responding to the Sydenham Hill residents, just to be absolutely clear, the policy states for Lewisham that a tall building is over 10 stories. So that's a policy which has been, or a figure number that's continued from our core strategy. We did consider options looking at reducing that. We did consider options looking at would it be more appropriate to vary that across the borough. we came to the conclusion that the 10-storey was a pretty tried and tested methodology through our core strategy that has served us well thus far, but also a fairly recognisable figure in terms of industry for what is considered as tall buildings. So to be absolutely clear, in terms of Sydenham Hill Ridge, there are no suitable sites for tall buildings identified in Sydenham Hill Ridge. We appreciate that because of the topography of Lewisham, there will be areas that are visually impacted by tall buildings proposed within the borough and also elsewhere in London. There's been some recent work by the NLA looking at the changing London skyline over the last 25 years, which is absolutely remarkable. So if you're standing on Telegraph Hill today looking at that protected view, that view is entirely different than what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It was even more different. So, London is evolving, and once again, we have a regional plan that has stated, and a London mayor that has stated, that tall buildings are part of the solution to tackle the housing crisis. So that's the sort of point that I want to make on that. In terms of we are jumping into a little bit of specifics, but I do think it's important in terms of responding to the Calvary Green. So in each of the evidence-based documents, the site that has been referred to has been assessed. I apologise for the confusion in terms of naming conventions, etc. But in terms of the 2022 document, it's actually within the Catford area of search. It's located immediately south of Catford, 10-minute walk essentially. So we included it within the Catford area of search, not Bellingham. And then in terms of the further work that the council did, it is included within a separate consideration of the tall building suitability zone from page 41 onwards. And just in terms of, I think there was a question about conservation areas, and we recognise that our conservation areas, our heritage assets, are sensitive. What I would say is, in a Lewisham context and a London context, if we are restricting development adjacent to, albeit I completely accept that a small proportion of the conservation area of Calvary Green does go into the site that the gentleman mentioned. If we were to restrict high density development on those sites, we would not be able to meet our housing targets. And London would not be able to meet its housing targets. So it's a question of how do we mitigate those impacts, and particularly, again, maybe I'm going into too much detail here on site specific, but we've looked at this site, we've tested it through the A21 development framework. Yes, there were assumptions within the London SLA and also through our regulation 18 of the capacities based on those SLA densities, but we tested that through the A21 framework to make sure that we were comfortable with the scale and the density that we were proposing there, and the council is. Now, again, that comes with a heavy caveat that there is further work to be done, and through the development management process, we will be expecting our development partners, in the same way as we do for every site, to come with that level of detail and that level of scrutiny. And it may well be that we come to a conclusion that actually it is not acceptable, or we may come to a conclusion that it is acceptable. But at the moment, the analysis that we've done is demonstrating that it is a suitable location for tall buildings, albeit of modest tall buildings, 10 to 12 stories. And obviously I understand that is significant, but in the scale of London and in the scale of Lewisham, it is at the lower end of the tall building spectrum.
If I could just add to that, in relation to David's point about further testing being required, this is why we're proposing modification MO15. We're suggesting that we amend policy wording for QD 04C to reflect the supporting text and say, although maximum heights are provided for each of the tall building suitability zones, proposers will still be expected to include robust design justifications for the heights proposed, including testing and key views.
Thank you for that. So the message I'm getting from the council in this is it's a principle in the policy, but it's the development management process that will ultimately determine the outcome. And obviously that has its process with its consultation.
Yes, that's correct. But I do want to pick up on the point that we are being asked by the London plan to identify these suitability areas, and we're being asked in the London plan to identify maximum building heights. And I do think, obviously, there is that testing to be done. But I do concede that when you establish these suitability areas and you establish these maximum heights, there will be a general perception from the development industry that those heights are generally accepted. Now, that is not the approach that the council comes to a pre-application discussion with, but obviously the council has prepared evidence, and then if that is backed up by evidence that the development industry provide, which looks at and responds to our policies and the London plan policies, then we will recommend that for approval.
Thank you. Astor Living, again, you've been very patient.
Oh, well,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been really useful, actually. And what Mr. Simon has done, as I think you indicated, is to usefully widen the debate beyond the narrow issue of the compliance with QD1. And what he's made clear is how and why some of the maximum heights which now appear in the policy have come about. And he's also indicated, I think really fairly, in the answers he's just given now also, that the analysis that's undertaken has its limitations. And it's those limitations that we want to draw to your attention, and how the London plan sets up the design-led approach to optimise, not only on a site-by-site application by application process, but through development planning. Our submissions, Ma'am, really focus on your question 1020 and the associated 1029, which is, if something's gone wrong with 1020, what are the modifications needed to make the plan sound? So I am going to use the framework of that very carefully crafted question to put the generality of our analysis, and then I'm going to ask the two gentlemen who sit to my right to give you proportionately the sort of chapter and verse as to why those submissions are good. And we begin with answering your question directly. We believe that the Connington Road Tesco site, and I appreciate we've got an allocation issue 17, so I'm going to do this in very broad terms, that the Tesco site, Connington Road, is correctly and robustly within the Central Lewisham tall building suitability zone. So a direct answer to your direct question, that is correct and robust. It's correct and robust because that's the zone that Allies and Morrison identified as the best placed zone in the borough and the most sustainable zone in the borough for tall buildings. We can go to the detail of that if necessary, but I think that's not controversial. However, in answer to the second part of 1020, we say that the emerging plan as a result of very late stage analysis, influenced as we heard by councillors, seeks to limit heights across the Tesco part of the site to 16 stories when the adjacent site is identified for 35. And we say that is not justified, and we say so for the following reasons. We say it's unsound in terms of the NPPF and the statute, which you've carefully set out in your guidance notes, so I needn't remind you of those. We say the limitation is not justified by an appropriate design-led analysis. A design-led analysis requires the local authority at this stage, in broad and proportionate terms, to consider design options that optimize the site having regard to context. That's policy D3. That design-led approach applies to development plan appraisals, para 3.3.3 of the London Plan, and it's quite clear from what Mr. Syme has said, that's not been done. So it's unsound because the limitation to 16, as opposed to the 35, which is in the evidence base, has not been justified by a design-led approach. Second, it's not justified by the external expert analysis, which is what's claimed in paragraph 10.20.1 of the justification in matter 10 presented by the council. Rather, it's inconsistent with what Allies and Morrison suggested, which was up to 35 stories, including on this site. So if my learned friend, Mr. Syme, wants to rely on what Allies and Morrison have done at Hounslow and elsewhere, which is not before the inquiry, by the way, I think he should point out that the stage which reduced it to 16 from 35 was not an Allies and Morrison stage at all. So it's not justified by design-led analysis as required by the London Plan. It's not justified by expert analysis. Further, the evidence base establishes that if you do limit it to 16 stories, it's not deliverable. Now, that's not for this debate. That's for issue 17 and issue 22. But it's right, since the question is, are the maximum heights right, that we at least put a flag in the sand to say that because it has an existing store on it, which is a massively valuable asset, and because of the risks associated with redevelopment, which are referred to in your questions in relation to the redevelopment of the allocation, the deliverability and thus the effectability and thus the soundness of limiting it to 16 stories must be a relevant consideration for this question. But I park it because we're going to come back to that on issue 17, I think in a week and a half's time. But it is unsound because it's not justified by design-led approach. It hasn't even been tested by reference to design-led approach. It isn't justified by what Allies and Morrison said. That was a much later analysis in which they played no significant part, and it's not deliverable. Second point, we do have a design-led approach and a design-led piece of evidence now before you, presented by Dr. Miele, who sits to my right, and it establishes, consistent with the Allies and Morrison position, that proposals as tall as 30 metres could be justifiable, and that's the test in policy D9 of the London Plan, a maximum which could be justifiable. 30 metres could be justifiable in townscape and heritage terms while still affecting across the site an appropriate transition to the balance of the context. Both of those things mean, we say, and I will add, because I should, that at that appropriate level spread across the site, the evidence will establish that there is a viable solution which is deliverable in the way that it isn't if you restrict it to 16 stories. And all of that means that we say the plan can and should be made sound, first by the removal of the rather late introduction of the 16 restriction, and replaced with a provision which allows at least parts of the site, to be developed to taller than that. We say the evidence establishes 30, but while still respecting and reflecting a transitional role within the townscape. And it's that issue that in particular Dr. Mealy will speak to. So that is the summary, the précis. If this was the O level, that would be the main points without the significant detail. We're not going to go into too much more detail, but I will, with your leave, ask Dr. Mealy to put a little flesh onto those bones.
I think out of all what you've just explained, I think there's been quite a lot of site-specific
Yes.
material in there,
Yes.
and I did try to encourage people to stick to the principles of the policy. I appreciate you've got a site. I've got that
Yes.
piece appended to your statement. In conscious of time,
Sure.
it's getting into a site-specific discussion today would not help us progress through this chapter. So I would urge you once again to try and keep your points to the evidence base of to underpin that policy.
Yes.
I appreciate there are sites within criterion C that.
Yes, that's the point. It's CC, which is in the actual policy, which would mean that we have to look at the methodology which has led to that. But I mean, if your guidance is to us to come back and make these points later, but to keep it narrow here, we'll clearly accept that.
I think I would urge you to do that.
Yes.
And we can talk about the site specifics when we get to that stage. Mr. Syme, your turbo has just gone up.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I thought I heard 30 meters there in terms of the proposal. Is it 30 stories?
30 stories, yeah.
30
if I said 30
stories.
meters, I misspoke.
Just
I'm
for
grateful.
clarity. So I'll take those 3 points in turn. The first was about a detailed design approach, and I think we concede and we acknowledge that the study that we have done and the evidence that we've prepared for the tall building policy is not a detailed design of every site allocation that we have within the plan. I hope the inspectors would agree that would be inconceivable through the local plan process to undertake that work. Hugely costly to the council, and I would make the point that wouldn't necessarily be in line with the MPPF in terms of providing a proportionate evidence base, proportionate for the strategic nature of the local plan. I accept that there are limitations to this study, but what the council is trying to do is respond to a London plan requirement, which clearly sets out what local plans should do. At the Regulation 18 stage, we were taking a more flexible approach. We received quite strong intervention from the GLA to tighten that up. We were also responding to our community and our community representatives who wanted to have a degree of certainty around those tall buildings. And therefore, we have prepared the evidence base to inform the local plan in that regard. The second point, again, I'm happy to debate whether we are experts in the field and provide you with my resume of my previous experience as a trained architect and an urban designer of over 25 years experience, as well as my colleagues to the left of me. We feel we have the local knowledge and the expertise to undertake the work. The work, the finer grain work was an internal study that was carried out by my design team. And the reason that we chose to do it internally was because we as officers are embedded within Lewisham and we have the knowledge on the ground to look at and really appreciate the considerations of existing and emerging character. And that's why we did it that way. I think the third point on not deliverable, I think we're going to pick this up at a later date, but I do want to just, at a more general sense, I want to just say in terms of viability and character, the council is not shirking away from its responsibility of delivering growth within the borough. It understands that we have to deliver dense developments, and it understands that in appropriate locations, tall buildings will need to be delivered. And hopefully through your site visits, you've seen that that is the case. But in terms of deliverability, that cannot be the starting point for a design-led solution. We cannot be starting with viability informing a design-led process. And again, I could point to numerous references in the NPPF, National Design Guide, the London Plan that supports this approach. It has to be a design-led approach which responds to the character of the existing area and the emerging character within that area as well. That has to be the starting point. Otherwise, we're not creating places that are going to be successful. So yes, whilst I accept that you don't agree with our conclusion, I think we've presented the case and the evidence that supports that conclusion. Again, I'm not going to, unless the inspectors want me to, go into specific detail on this site and the reasons why we feel that 16 is the maximum. I think we'll pick that up, but that would be my response to the three broad points that have been presented.
Just got a comment regarding the setup in the room. Some microphones are being left on, and David isn't being picked up on the broadcast. If everyone could just remember to switch their microphones off when they're not speaking. I know I left mine on.
Sorry, just to finalise my point here. Again, I think we've already said it, but important to reiterate that there is inherent flexibility within the policy, and we accept that through a kind of design-led process, there might be variations to some of those heights. There is, we do make it clear that the maximum height of buildings shall not normally be more than, and specify the heights within those.
Thank you. In terms of just a question that's percolating around in my mind, the direction from the London Plan, you talked about sort of sensitivity areas and give you some guidance for the local plan. Does the London Plan specifically require you to specify heights in your local plan?
Yes, it does. So supporting text. Sorry, I'll just get the reference for you. Paragraph 3.9.2. It says, point 2, in these locations, determine the maximum height that could be acceptable.
Thank you, because I've just not got the London Plan in front of me, so I just wanted to check. I'm going to come back to Astor Living.
I think very quickly on that last point, I think Mr. Simons picked up very carefully what the London Plan says, which could be acceptable, is what the London Plan expects. But it also expects, as part of that analysis, for the design-led approach to be undertaken at the local plan stage. And it's a judgment for you, Ma'am, as to whether that's been done in this case, hearing what Mr. Syme said, and bearing in mind that the starting point for the capacity analysis was a SHLA that was derived from an old approach in the London Plan that's been foregone for some time. So that's the first point. The second point on flexibility, which I know one of my colleagues would want to speak to, has to be taken with care, because it doesn't mean that as examining authorities, you're entitled to say, well, let's not worry about the 16 stories because it could be more. There is a requirement, even at this stage, for that to be sound. And sound does include capable of being effective, which means capable of being deliverable during the lifetime of the plan. So viability is bound to fit into that. Could I ask you please to look at the policy itself? And this is a generic point, not a specific point, because what Mr. Syme is right in saying is it does say shall not normally be more than, C in the main text, capital C. But that has to be read, of course, with D, which says development proposals for tall buildings will only be permitted where they are in a tall building suitability zone, comma, align with the appropriate height ranges set out above, and it's demonstrated that. So the flexibility he speaks of is really not as great as perhaps he was suggesting, which underlines the need to ensure that the limit set at 16 late in the day through the process is an appropriate one. My final point on this is that Mr. Syme was very clear, as is the council in its statement, to rely on the expertise of the external allies in Morrison and the approach that's been used in other local authorities that he outlined. But I think it's fair to say they weren't involved in the last stage. I'm not at all demeaning Mr. Syme's analysis, but he can't rely on their expertise, London-wide as it is, for the last part and the reduction that came towards the end of the process that that we are concerned about. Thank you for listening. I'll pass you on to my colleague.
Mr. Harris is determined to make me redundant. He's covered my question, so thank you, ma'am.
All right. Okay, thank you. Mr. Syme. No, Legacy Toblerone. Thank you. Just bear with me 2 moments.
Should say I'm not therefore deploying Dr. Mile, who sits next to me patiently. We've listened very much to your guidance, and you'll hear from him in the next session.
Thank you. I'm obliged, given the time. In terms of policy QD4, I'm conscious it's coming up to 11:20, and we do need to take a comfort break for people. Are there any final points on this particular policy? I like to try and build consensus around the table in sessions, but there are times when that may not be achievable within the time that we've got in hearing sessions, and it's something that we have to take away and reflect on everything that we've heard. Site-specific issues will come back at the site-specific site allocations stage. We're very conscious they are going to be quite intense sessions as well. Cutherley Green, your Toblerone's gone up, sir.
Thank you, madam. I'm just wondering, are we going to come back to the modification, or are you hoping to finish with QD4 at this point? Because I just had a small comment on the modification MO 175.
Yes, I did say thank you at the start of policy QD4. I would just jump forward and put the modifications at the end. So taking the modifications as a sort of a collective, we've got them listed on the agenda. So in terms of the first couple, if you'd like to make your point, and then I'll just ask the council just to summarise the other modifications to where we've got to, so we can hopefully close QD4 session.
Madam, I'm grateful for that. In respect of, as I said, MO 175, which relates to the wording of QD4D brackets C, this the addition that's proposed is welcomed, but of course the way the policy is worded uses the term including, and then it provides a list which has now been lengthened. And whilst it talks about the need for sensitivity to a site's immediate and wider context, when you have a list, you actually then think of the items that are on that list. And I do feel that, therefore, the inclusion of conservation areas in the addition, the modification, should state conservation areas and setting, because that is covered by the NPPF paragraphs 200 and 201. Setting is a requirement of that. So yes, I know it says immediate and wider context, but if you're going to put it in the list, then it should be conservation area and setting. And the other point would to be add after the areas characterized by consistent building heights and topography. And this, I think, picks up on comments from the Sydenham Hill Society. An additional item, significant open spaces and trees, because whilst topography is a point that they've raised, it is, again, if you're going to have that list, trees are a significant element in themselves, and significant open spaces, not minor ones. But so those were my suggested additions to that modification.
Thank you. Mr. Syme, if you'd just like to summarise the modifications that we've got suggested to us as a collection.
Yeah, so the first modification, MO15, I think my colleague picked up on, which is just to reflect the point that although maximum heights are provided for each of for the tall building suitability zones, proposals will be expected to include robust design justifications for their heights proposed, including testing key views, etc. It's a fairly standard wording that should be in the text, I would argue. Modification 16 QD04 is just some additional text which looks at the impacts, including the building's immediate vicinity, surrounding area, and elsewhere in London. And we've added a text, particularly in relation to places in neighbouring boroughs. And then MO 174. We are suggesting a modification to pick up on a point that the inspectors made regarding areas where, particularly in council estates, etc., where tall buildings may exist, and by the very nature of the policy, we would be unable to then build tall buildings within those areas. So we're just suggesting that we have an additional word there. We've looked at we've looked at other tall building policies that have been adopted recently, such as Bexley, and they include the word generally be resisted for tall buildings outside of those areas. That will provide, again, the flexibility through the design-led process to test those sites that do have tall buildings which are not identified in the study. In terms of MO175, the reason that we've included the list is to provide greater clarity on what the diagram is essentially saying, and responds to the criteria that was used through the analysis. I've got no problem at all including conservation areas and its setting. I think with the strategic open spaces and trees, if I may, I may leave that within the capable hands of the inspectors. I'm not sure that trees is necessarily a sensitivity for tall buildings, particularly of the scale that we identify tall buildings as. We're talking, 32 meters and above. I'm not sure there would be. I'll leave that in the capable hands of the inspectors. There's some additional text to paragraph 5.33, which is just a reference to the tall building review and deletion of "and" between the 2020 and the 2022. I believe that's it.
I think there's a final point. I'm urging to sort of try to move to a comfort break. Is it a very specific point, please?
Yes, Madam. It's just in response to the matter on trees. I would just refer to the NPPF paragraph 135C. This is planning policies should ensure that developments are sympathetic to local character and history and landscape setting. And paragraph 136, that appropriate measures are in place to secure long-term maintenance of newly planted trees and that existing trees are retained wherever possible. So there is a basis for my suggestion, of including that element.
Thank you. I have a note. Anything further from the council?
Yeah, just to add that that is a list of considerations that were considered through the evidence base. And, whilst we were looking at the physical characteristics, it wasn't a key criteria that was identified through that evidence. And hence my nervousness about including it within that diagram.
I hear everyone's points on that. We shall reflect on that. Looking at the time, ladies and gentlemen, even my computer's gone to sleep. I think we need to take a comfort break, and then we shall come back and look to policy QD5 and view management.
Can I say, ma'am, we're not involved in that policy. We've made no submissions in relation to that. So would you excuse us if we leave? We don't mean any disrespect, but we don't think we need to be here. Nice though it would be. So when you come back, we probably won't be here.
That's absolutely fine. We're comfortable with people leaving as and when necessary. And if it's during a session, people just tend to leave quietly. It's 11:26, everyone. If we could return at 11:40, if that's possible, is that sufficient time for a comfort break? I'm looking around the table for some nods. Thank you. 11:40. We're now adjourned. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to resume Matter 10 session, please. I think just about everyone's taken their seats, the ones that have come back. So, in terms of the view management policy, this is another one that has attracted some comments, hasn't it? So I think we'll be having a debate about this one. Now, turning to my agenda, I have a question about the criterion, so 10.30, and that question is about justification of the evidence, and are the views justified by the evidence? I think from our perspective, you know, in the council's statement, there is an acknowledgement that there's further work to be done. And I think in your statement, you also seek guidance on how to progress that from ourselves in terms of option 1 or option 2. So I'm just looking in the council's statement in their response to question 10.30 if people wish to follow. I think in terms of making sure there is sufficient evidence, it's about making sure the evidence guides the policy as opposed to filling in gaps. But in this particular aspect, we've got local views, workshop views, and sort of my understanding of that is there is a bit of mislabeling going on. The two options are remove the local views or the workshop views from the plan, or the formal assessment process is undertaken subsequently to the local plan examination. I think our initial view on that is that, you know, further work is required to make sure those views are, if they're to be retained in the plan. If I understand them correctly, they're sort of community derived views. Now, I would be concerned if we were striking those out, because they are community led, and therefore there is an importance to them. So I think we are looking towards option 2 in terms of making sure there is the evidence there for the views. And what's running through my mind at the moment is whether that evidence exists already, and it's not about creating new evidence, but is it a collation of, or is collation of evidence, existing material, possible that could then form part of a short document to underpin those, Mr. Syme?
I wonder if I may just explain the context to the participants here, just in case they haven't read our statement. So this relates to figure 5.11, which is a series of views across the borough. What we've got on those views is the LVMF views, which are the London-wide protected views. We then have a number of local views. Unhelpfully, and I apologise for this, the diagram is mislabeled, but the local views are essentially views which have been carried forward from the core strategy document as those key views within the borough, and those inspectors do have evidence to support them. The other views are the workshop views. So the resident associations and societies may remember that we carried out workshops as part of the characterisation study that looked at key local views, and we determined, or we gathered those together, and they have been represented in the plan. Now, those have been represented since the Regulation 18 consultation document, so they have been consulted on, both at the Regulation 18 and 19, but the Council acknowledges that it has not carried out a comprehensive analysis of those views, and that's the point that the Council has made to the inspectors. Now, there are some of those views which relate to other views captured within our conservation area appraisals, but not all. So there would require, or there would need to be, additional new evidence to support those views. And again, we'll be guided by the inspectors on how to proceed.
Just to clarify the process, you say there were workshops undertaken with local residents groups and communities, and the views that were put forward by those communities were kind of taken on board as part of the characterisation study. Did the characterisation study form a view on those views, if you're with me? Did it kind of did it do any kind of appraisal of those views, or did it just accept those as local viewpoints?
It didn't, unfortunately, no. So it accepted those views, it presented those views, but I think the evidence that we've acknowledged is missing is an appraisal of those views.
So when those viewpoints were put forward by local communities, is there a sort of a paper trail in terms of why those communities wanted those views represented, for example? And I'm just thinking in terms of building that evidence and pulling that evidence together. And you say, if you sort of bear with me for a moment, that there may be some overlap with the already identified views, because I'm thinking that may help in bringing that evidence together. If there is overlap with already identified more strategic views, then that may cover the evidence base for the local viewpoint, if you get my meaning.
I do, yeah. Just to be absolutely clear, there will be a number of views which do not overlap with established views, and therefore, you know, it's how we prepare that evidence if that's the route that we want to go down. Ruth, in terms of the paper trail.
Yes, what we have in terms of a paper trail is a marked up map with handwriting of where the views were proposed by the community.
And then we also have the exchange of emails between ourselves and our consultants who were working on the characterization at the time, exploring the views. And again, you know, apologies for this, but there was identified need to appraise those views at the time, which didn't get done.
I mean, would it be usual for the council to take on face value those local views put forward, including them, you know, actually going as far as including them on figure 5.11 without necessarily, you know, if the council had concerns about those local views, would they have been included in that figure, for example?
No, the council is not concerned about those views, and I think they could be helpful in the development management process as well, where you know, when we are looking at key views to test through the development management process. Obviously, we turn to colleagues within the council looking at what those key views are, but this would be helpful in providing additional guidance through that. So the council isn't concerned that the views in, and once again, I'd like to say that they have been consulted on through the Regulation 18 and 19 public consultation. I guess the question that we're asking the inspectors is whether or not that is robust enough at this current time.
Give us a moment. Yeah, we're just thinking out loud on this one. Obviously, the other views have, they have an evidence base to them in terms of the way they have been identified. There is a kind of a paper trail in relation to the local views. I suppose I was just thinking out loud and thinking whether there could be clarification in the supporting text to recognise and to differentiate, if you like, between the sort of views where there is a more sort of firm evidence base and the locally identified views. It's just trying to think of a pragmatic way forward, really.
The council would definitely be happy with that. Again, we'll be guided by the inspectors.
I think it partly depends as well in terms of, how long it would take to pull together any evidence in terms of local views, just being mindful of the time frame. Coming back to discussion on housing targets and things we had the other day, whether there's a compromise as a way forward, and possibly looking at that overlap between the local views and strategic views where there may be evidence to support the local views which were put forward. That might be worth looking at as well. So yeah, I think that there's potentially that further option, an option 3, in terms of how we move forward with it. But I am conscious that in differentiating in terms of the status, it could be seen to be lowering the status of the local views. So just something to bear in mind, I think.
Would you like us to consider that and come back with a third option?
It's difficult for us because we don't know the degree to which the evidence can be pulled together, or how much further work would need to be done to justify those views, if you know what I mean. So I think it's something the council need to think about, but it's just to flag up the potential implications of the third option in terms of potentially lowering the status of those local views. And I think it'd have to be very careful wording to reflect that.
So I think that would need to feature on the action list, Mr. Syme. I think that does need a little bit more further thought. Are there any participants who got concerns about views being omitted? I think Sydenham Hill residents and also Sydenham Hill Society have raised the issue of some views.
Thank you. Yes, we feel very sorry. There's a lot of echo. We feel strongly that significant omissions around the Sydenham Hill area. I don't actually have figure 1.11, but I do have figure 5.3, which is London strategic views and Lewisham local views. I'm hoping they're the same, to be honest. If you can look at it, the most southwesterly view is the one up Kirkdale to the top to where Sydenham Hill dips down to Forest Hill. But there is a lot of Sydenham Hill that goes towards the Crystal Palace Tower, which is where these peaks in height exist. And they've been completely omitted from the views map. So I'm talking about both the views up to the ridge, but also from across the much wider landscape of London and Kent, for whom the ridge is quite significant. We would very much appreciate it if that could be considered. I did raise this with Lewisham, and I received an email back saying that fundamentally, if the views had not been identified in the London plan, that Lewisham didn't feel it had that responsibility. I therefore, on their advice, took it up with the Mayor of London, who wrote back to say, We would far prefer it if the local authority would deal with this, because the management of planning and trees and so on sits with them. Those emails have been submitted to the hearing, but because they came in much later, they're going to come up under matter 21. But it is, I believe, relevant that there is an implied agreement that the ridge has important views, both up to and from it, and yet there is no one responsible for those views, seemingly. So we would very much like it if Lewisham would either say, we put our hand up, we want to do this, or Lewisham would support us in trying to make a claim to the Mayor of London, and hopefully a successful one, to get these views retained. Our fear is not so much for now, immediately, it's for future generations. This ridge has been there a very long time, but could be so quickly lost in the great push to bring in buildings. We're not against buildings per se, but lower rise buildings have been the norm there, and the tree line has been sacrosanct for centuries. And, you know, we already have one example of it being lost or reduced. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had one or two technical difficulties with the microphones there. Of there was some echo. I think has somebody been into the cupboard at the back to have a look at it? Right, so just as a reminder, I know you've got devices and things that are near to hand because you need them, but there sort of needs to be a bit of a cordon sanitaire around the microphones because they're sensitive to picking things up, and we need to make sure anyone who's watching online will be able to actually hear all of the debate as well as everyone in the room. Just turning to Mr. Simon on the points made by Sydenham Hill residents and the Sydenham Hill Ridge, please.
Yeah, I think if I may, I think there's two issues here. One is in terms of figure 5.11 and any further analysis that needs to be done in the local views. I guess there's a question about if after those workshops that were carried out as part of the characterization, there are more views that groups and the general public have suggested. How do we deal with those? I think that is one question. I think the second question is more about at a strategic level. I think there is support from Sydenham Hill about elevating the view from Sydenham Hill Ridge to and from at a London-wide level. Clearly, there is an interrelationship between the local plan and the London plan. And obviously, the first step would be to have or recognise that view within the local plan if it is appropriate. But then we'd need to work with our GLA colleagues to look at, you know, any future revision of the LVMF views and see whether that would be appropriate to have that within that strategic document. Clearly, at that time, you know, as we currently stand, we're just simply identifying the LVMF views within our policy.
So I think we're looking for a way forward on this matter of the local views, aren't we? Here in terms of you know, the Sydenham Hill Residents Association are looking at trying to either get their view into the local plan or get it elevated to that sort of more strategic view. Now, clearly, we're not able to influence that more strategic setting, the London plan, and what that includes. So I think that's a matter that needs to be, you know, had a conversation outside of this hearing session, and that's a different process when the London plan is reviewed together with its evidence base. But in terms of how we could take this topic forward within the local plan process, I'm looking to the council for some thoughts and some options, please.
One option could be that we, you know, as we've identified within our written response, there may require some evidence, or there may be a need to provide some evidence for the identified workshop views, apologies, / local views, depending on the key, that we also wrap up with that any remaining views that have been identified through the Regulation 18/19 consultation process, including the Sydenham Hill Ridge, and do an analysis of that, and then that feeds into the local plan. My only concern with that is that it hasn't been subject to the public consultation in the same way as these workshop and local views have been through the local plan process. But again, I'll be guided by the inspectors on that. The council has no immediate concerns in terms of undertaking the work if that's the direction from the inspectors.
Would the council look to consultants to do that, work, do the work in-house?
I think we would do the work in-house if at all possible, because I think that may be quicker, but we might look at a couple of options there in terms of speed.
As you say, bringing in a new view or new views at this stage, thinking through the potential consequences of that, isn't it, in terms of potential objections that may come forward potentially through the development industry on that, and introducing something at quite a late stage may cause issues. So it's a question of whether to confine that assessment to the existing views which have been identified.
Just a point to make. There are alternative routes to identify views other than the local plan process. I know that Sydenham Hill is an identified neighbourhood plan area. It has got a neighbourhood forum, so that could be one option through the neighbourhood planning process. I think there are also a number of conservation areas, but I'm not quite sure where the exact view is. But I guess I'm making the point that there could be alternative mechanisms and options if we feel that introducing views at this late stage that haven't been subject to the consultation is ill-advised.
Yes, building on what David just said about other ways of identifying views, we are in the process of producing an area of special local character assessment document that will be going out to consultation shortly, and within that document there will be views identified. So that would mean that they are part in a formal planning document, but not in the local plan. So that might be a way of addressing this issue at this stage.
Okay, and just in terms of that document of the area of special local character, what status would that have? I'm just trying to think of it where it fits in the bigger picture.
It's essentially a kind of planning note. It has no formal status. It is not an SPD because the areas of special local character are non-designated heritage assets, essentially, but they will have the statement of significance, which has then been consulted on. So we're fairly confident that our development partners will be responding to that as they do with other non-designated heritage assets. But it's just to be clear that it doesn't have the same status as a conservation area appraisal or clearly the local plan.
We're just thinking of a way forward to move things on because we're conscious of time. At the risk of giving the council more homework, given that the three options we've discussed there, could the council just set a note out on each of those options? I think in terms of the third option, undertaking additional work, it would be really useful to have so many timescales for that, because obviously it could have implications for the adoption of the plan. So I think it'd be useful to set out the options and then we can take a view on that. I think potentially the speediest option might be to look at differentiating the supporting text, possibly alluding to further work, and the fact that could be picked up as part of a review. That might be the best way to avoid slowing the plan process down, thinking aloud. But I think it would be useful just to have a note of the various options and then we can form a view on that.
Yep, we can do that, yep.
Okay, let's just look at some of there are some modifications to QD5, and I'm conscious, Quad, for Landsec, you've been very patient at the end of the table there. Is there anything particularly that you need to respond to?
We've been patient because all matters have been discussed adequately. Thank you. So there's nothing that I need to raise at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let's just look through the modifications as proposed, please. We've got a number for QD5, and I believe we might have had a modification to a modification this morning. If you could just outline that one, I'm very conscious that things that sort of come in hot off the press, people in the room will need to know what that says as well, so everyone can follow. Mr. Syme, would you like to just lead us through the modifications proposed, please?
Yeah, so modification 178 to QD05, just introduce further text in part A for clarification and reference to figure 5.11, London strategic views and Lewisham local views. It's removing some text which effectively is repeated elsewhere. Part B, there's an inclusion just to make reference to those listed in Schedule 1 in Part 5. And then we've reflected on the wording of Part C, which development proposals must not harm. Looking at the London plan and reflecting on that, we have changed that wording to should in those instances. And then just a minor tweak in terms of the wording of Part C, which removes a viewer's ability to recognise and appreciate with the view and the appreciation of landmark elements. So this is just about greater clarity. Again, MO 17 policy QD05 part C is should instead of must, and then should instead of wherever possible. There is an amendment to MO paragraph 5.38, which is MO17, which has been superseded then by the modification to the modification. And that's just a kind of factual representation. So apologies, we removed there are two strategic views, etc., incorrectly, and that has been added back in.
Okay, is there anything finally from any participant on their representations in relation to QD5? Thank you. Anything finally from the council on that one? Thank you very much. Right, let's move on to QD6, please. That's optimizing site capacity. Now, on the agenda, I've got noted a couple of modifications. I didn't know whether Landsec needed to come in on this policy or wish to come in on this policy. And I think another representative, not at the table today, Lewisham House number 1, they were talking about indicative capacities in that policy. So I think we'll start with the modifications, please, just to sort of set out tweaks that the council are suggesting to us.
Yes, two modifications. MO 180, which is just the inclusion of for the site after optimal capacities, just for greater clarity. And then MO 18, we're suggesting within the supporting text 5.44 that we provide greater clarity on the indicative capacities where we insert the text. The indicative capacities identified for the site allocations provide a starting point for the process and are not intended to be a cap on potential development quantum. This is a point that we've made throughout the document, but it feels pertinent to add that clarification into the supporting text.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the concern raised by Lewisham House number 1, in terms of the policy should be acknowledging that the final site capacity should be based on that detailed site analysis at that stage. I think their concern was about mixed use sites and how that works in the mixed use context. The council have any response to that, please?
In terms of the indicative capacities, agreed. In terms of non-residential, I think we've had this discussion before, but again, those are indicative capacities. They have, we've set out how those have been attained through the site allocation background paper. In some instances, they are reflective of approved planning applications or advanced pre-apps. In other situations, they have evolved through a kind of mathematical basis using assumptions from the London SHLA, but also assumptions on the percentage of non-residential which would be suitable in particular locations, all set out in the site allocation background paper. Again, what we're not saying is that these are absolutes, and the flexibility is there and within the local plan through the design-led approach to arrive at the right answer for the site through that design-led approach.
For Landsec, would you like to make a contribution?
What I'd like to say is that we support the council's proposed modifications, in particular MO 18. and working with the council, feel that that clarification works well for us and reflects the approach between the local plan and the development management process. So we support that. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Just so everyone's clear, the modifications process we will talk about later on, but there will be a consultation period on all of those modifications. So the document that comes out, you will be able to see all of the detail that will be the modifications, and that will be a 6-week consultation period in due course. If there's nothing further on QD6, I'm going to move on to QD7. So QD7 is the amenity and agent of change policy. There are a couple of modifications that the council are proposing. Mr. Simon, if you'd just like to take us through those, please.
Yes, so modification MO181, and this is in response to the inspector's MIQ, which relates to part CE, existing green spaces, open spaces, and maintained as tranquil and quiet areas. We reflected on the wording there and are suggesting that we remove maintain as tranquil and quiet areas. And have the addition of can effectively maintain their existing uses. And I think we feel that that then resolves the matter that was raised through the MIQ. And then MO182 is a typographical error. There is a rogue title in there, energy efficient, that shouldn't be in there.
Thank you for that. Anything further on from any representatives who've got representations on this? Anything final from the council? Thank you. Let's move on to policy QD8 then, please. That's the high quality design. Again, I think as you can see from the agenda, we're going to move through a series of policies with modifications. So by and large, I don't have any further particular questions in relation to those. It's just to outline them from the council's perspective, so everyone is clear. And if there's any questions relating to them, then we can obviously take them at that point. Mr. Syme, thank you.
Yeah, so proposed modification 183 includes the addition of space between minimum and standards, just to provide greater clarity. 1084 is a little bit of a reworking of part G of the policy, again, to provide greater clarity to QD8 part G. So that it would read, development proposals for housing should maximise the provision of dual aspect dwellings and seek to minimise the provision of single aspect dwellings, in particular north facing dwellings. Proposals for single aspect dwellings should have particular regard to etc. etc. This is in response to the London Plan guidance, which recently the GLA clarified should not be read as a kind of prescriptive guidance, and actually flexibility within local plans was required. We're responding to that. And then paragraph 5.68 of the supporting text amendment to that paragraph, which says the small sites SPD provides guidance on delivering housing on sites of 0.25 hectares or less and how to respond to common site constraints for infill sites with existing residential areas. Policy QD8 should be read in conjunction with policy QD6 optimizing sites. So that's just a cross-reference to the small sites policy for those applicants that have sites of less than 0.25 hectares.
Thank you. Any particular comments on those proposals? No? Thank you. So let's move into QD9. And again, Mr. Syme, I'm going to turn to you. There's a series of modifications. Please don't feel that you're being rushed. Take your time if you need to pause just to get the right page. We are moving through the agenda.
Yeah, so there's a number of modifications proposed to QD9 in response to some of the issues raised by, or the MIQs raised by the inspectors. So we are proposing a modification to Part C of the policy, which states innovative and contemporary designs will, and we've removed only to make it more positive and greater clarity, so will be supported, where we've crossed out are of an exceptional design quality and comply with the above. The reason that we've done that is when rereading the policy, it could be read that essentially we were trying to stifle innovation and contemporary design, and that certainly wasn't the intention of that Part C. Modification 187, Part E. We have removed the reference to retain 50% of the original garden area. There was a question by the inspectors of the evidence base for that. We don't think the evidence is sufficiently robust, and therefore we are planning to remove that and use the development management process to assess the suitability when those applications come in. MO 188, this is some additional text that we are suggesting. So Part F states new units or rooms created by a residential alteration or extension must, and before we had ensure adequate living and amenity space for all intended occupiers. We've crossed that out and we've included meet and where possible exceed the housing quality standards outlined in policy QD8, high quality housing design. That's just a cross reference. Apologies, there's a couple more. MO 189 is removing the only within Part H. So the policy will read basement development will be permitted where it can suitably demonstrate that the development and then continues. This is the council amending this policy to be more positive instead of negative in response to MIQ questions. And then finally, we've removed the Part K of the policy, again in response to the MIQ questions, which we acknowledge relates to building control policies and not planning.
Thank you for that. Any comments on those? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Syme. We'll move on to policy QD 10. It's a couple of modifications. So that's the infill and backland sites, garden land and amenity areas, please.
Yes, so QD10 modification 191, we're proposing a number of changes within some of the criteria here. So the insertion of well-designed prior to the start of Part A, so well-designed development proposals on infill and backland sites, garden land, we've struck out including back gardens, and amenity areas that are sensitive to local character can play an important role in delivering new housing as set out in policy HO2, optimising the use of small housing sites. Development proposals will, and we've crossed out only, be supported where, and then it goes on. And again, the intention here is to provide greater clarity, but also to provide a more positive approach to the wording of the policy. Criteria C, they maximise opportunities to restore local character repair street frontage or the appearance of existing buildings which detract, and including from positive local character. In terms of D, we have excluded, so that it starts development proposals on backland sites, and we will only be supported where they do some errors crept in there, so we've deleted that text. Development proposals on backland sites should not introduce gates or other design features that are unnecessarily restrict or prevent public access to or through the site, and we've added unless they are required for security or privacy. There's a factual error in terms of the labelling of the criteria on both F and G, I believe, and then we have included. Get this right. We have included some text in what in part G, so development proposals that will result in a loss of garden land, and we've included within enclosed perimeter blocks. This is consistent with our small sites SPD and the terminology around that, including proposals for separate dwellings. We've included, or we've removed some text there relating to the loss of garden land, including private back gardens of perimeter blocks, because we've included that further or before. And again, we're just reiterating the loss of garden land within closed perimeter blocks will only be considered acceptable in exceptional circumstances, and then the text is the same. Again, this is to provide greater clarity and consistency with the policy and the adopted SPD. There are two further modifications in the supporting text. Modification 192, which is paragraph 5.74. We've removed the term slab block to linear block. Linear block is a much more recognisable terminology, and is also used within the latest guidance from the London Plan, so that feels appropriate there. I may have strayed on to QD. I am going to stray on to QD 11, haven't I? I'll stop there.
You are indeed. You said there were two more, and I thought, hang on, I've only got one more. Right. Anything on those? I think QD 10 had quite a number of tweaks to it, didn't it, Mr. Syme? So thank you for reading all of that. Anything particular?
Thank you, Madam. I feel a bit concerned because we didn't make any representations on this particular policy, but it does strike me that a cross-reference to policy HE2, something to take into account the protection of heritage assets, ought to be included for background development.
Thank you for that. In terms of sort of sticking to representations, I appreciate your honesty on that front. If you haven't got a representation on it, I understand where you're coming from. In terms of policy QD 11, then, so moving on, Mr. Syme, I think we've got a modification on there, and then we'll move on to QD 12, and then we'll finish the matter.
Yeah, so modification 193, which is supporting text, paragraph 5.89. This was in response to an MIQ around the flexibility of the policy, particularly for those shop fronts with that are not in conservations and areas of special local character in terms of modern shop fronts. So we've put contemporary shop front designs will be supported in appropriate locations. All new and altered shop fronts should apply inclusive and safe principles. If a shop front is replaced or altered, the design should respect the characteristic of the host building. We have then inserted for shop fronts in conservation areas and areas of special local character or of listed or locally listed buildings, original historic shopfront windows and framework features should be retained or restored where appropriate. And this just means that the supporting text doesn't apply to shop fronts out with